to get to the table, not only because of embedded cultural norms that maybe prevent them getting to the table, but also because of the workload. Because in a conflict situation or in a normal situation, women's workload can be very full. That looking after the family, etc., working at the same time. So we discussed. We kind of linked this to the question of how can we best address the large exclusion of women from the peace process, and we discussed the fact that maybe women need to be brought in complementary measures to begin with. For example, in observer status. Not that this is ideal, but as a way to get to the negotiating table. Through civil society groups, and as Ruth said, to be prepared to be bored, but it's a way to get to the table at the beginning there. We also discussed the first question here, which says, how has the involvement of women in peace processes, negotiations and agreements shaped the contemporary peace processes and their resultant agreements? And we just mentioned the Irish context and how the Women's Coalition was extremely important during the peace process, but how the involvement of women has deteriorated since. And we discussed the fact that if 1325 had been in existence at the time, the result might have been different. So this kind of leads on to the idea of how important 1325 could be in post-2000 agreements. In addition, we looked at what are the new opportunities for women rising from peace processes. And there is the obvious possibility of bringing in possibly quotas. So because the agreement is shaping the future society in a sense, that there is the possibility of change that can be written into the agreement. So possibly bringing in quotas. There's the where an agreement makes changes to the constitution, there's possible changes to previously discriminatory laws. Also, we mentioned that actually quite often with peace processes they try to be rushed through to a ceasefire. So actually bringing 1325 into the equation could actually slow the process down and bring to a sort of a reasonable time frame, which actually might give time to bring in women's issues to the agenda, and also time to bring the correct amount of resources to the process. Finally, we looked at the question of I suppose actually is 1325 a useful mechanism to bring women to political decision making? I've kind of just covered that already, but we also mentioned in terms of that is that actually donors have a big influence on the negotiations, and for those member states that have a commitment to 1325, that they can be use donor pressure to bring women's issues to the agenda and bring women into the negotiations. Ultimately we said that one more point was that states like to look good. So actually by having a mechanism like 1325 and for states to support it, it's a kind of gives extra clout behind to support women coming to the negotiating table. And ultimately we said it's not perfect, and it's not going to bring women in vast numbers to the negotiating table, but it's a good step in the right direction.
Thanks very much, Heidi. And just to say that Rona and Karen will be taking notes that women have to order to sort of assist them and to be part of that process. Okay, move on to Group B, Group A, which was sexual domestic violence and women's rights post-conflict. Is that clear?
Group 2. Okay. We didn't stick to the questions at all. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
This is Group 1, is it?
Okay. We first of all spoke about the culture of silence and shame around sexual and domestic violence and how this leaves a vacuum to be able to actually discuss and have dialogue around it. We talked about asylum seekers and the fact that in certain countries they're offered no help with these experiences, and Erica told us about the contrast between ex-Yugoslav and Sudanese asylum seekers, and how the fact that Sudanese women, because they've been rooted in community and had been together as women, that had more chance to recover from these experiences and to speak about them, and that brought us on to talking about radical feminism and the use of consciousness raising and talking about experience and dialogue and linking experience to structure and inequality rather than individualising it or personalising it. We talked about in Northern Ireland the lack of contact with the police in some communities left a vacuum also for where women could go to deal with these issues or to get justice. We then talked about the UNHCR and the fact that victims of sexual abuse in the site could gain asylum through talking about the sexual abuse, so they had to construct their identity as a victim and take on the role as a victim to actually gain asylum. And in some cases of women having to make up stories of sexual abuse to get fast-tracked, say for example for surgery for female genital mutilation. We talked about the distinction between perpetrators and victims and the fact that it's possibly too simplistic. For example, in the case of child soldiers who commit rape. And then we talked about how current problems in society aren't, like in post-conflict societies, aren't actually linked back to historic problems. We don't recognise the past as impacting on our present. How to take ownership of experience, then continually putting people in the box of a victim and trying to actually take ownership of your own experience, and the institutionalisation of memory. Then we moved on to funding issues. We were talking about budget cuts and how that's going to affect women's centres and centres for domestic violence and rape crisis. Are they going to have to open up their services to men, and what effect will that have? And then that brought us on to talking about women's spaces. So for example, if you have separate women's groups, for example in political parties, then women aren't allowed to actually enter the main party. And Erica, how do you describe it? As they were seen as invading the main space and they weren't allowed to. And that to get in a position of power you can't actually associate with women's programmes because it's not seen as powerful. That was it.
Okay, thanks very much again. Psychologically, the space that women need to be able to talk about those experiences and to be able to take ownership of what happened, and that big issue that we're all facing of cuts, particularly to those organisations that are there in the field working with women who have been abused, and the impact of that when there's no help and support out there when they need it. Thank you, thanks for that table. And also just to remind people that at the end of the session they give their notes to Melanie and they will be incorporated into the report that's coming out afterwards. I'm just going to work my way around the room, so the next table is the one where Yvonne Galligan is, and that session is on women, peace and security, new conceptual challenges and opportunities, and Alex is the...
It's Ronan.
Alex
Ronan, yeah.
Ronan, away you go.
The idea of, well, talking about gender mainstreaming earlier, well, whose mainstreaming is it? Whose interests are being most represented by the implementation and the mainstreaming of 1325 and similar? The diversity of conceptions, of course, is always a positive, because we can't obviously categorise women as a single entity and have women's interests as a single narrative, because it's just not true. However, the interpretations of 1325 have very practical implications when it's a donor organisation. For example, Julia talked about the EU and how the EU's particular interpretation of what 1325 actually means can have massive implications for what actually happens on the ground in terms of funding, what gets funded, who gets funded, and we thought that was quite interesting. So how do you strike a balance between, yes, accepting that we need to have a diversity of discourse, but at the same time understanding that when a discourse is selected and mainstreamed, what the implications of that are. There was a very interesting point about the idea of a post-colonial deconstruction of so-called like accepted 1325 assumptions. How do we, kind of going in with international organisations, for example, going in with a particular agenda to local spaces, saying, promoting quite a neoliberal agenda in some senses, individual rights and stuff like that. How does that square with local practices, local conflict resolution processes and things like that? And then, of course, the idea that gender doesn't exist as an oppression in and of itself, and how does 1325 account for intersectionality and different types of oppression that relate to gender? I think that was pretty much, yeah, that was it.
Thanks. And again, when posing perhaps their ideas or, do you call it the neoliberal agenda on other countries whose culture and traditions would be quite different and proceed in a different way, it's something needs to be explored. Thanks. I'll move on then to Anne Carr's group. Anne was looking at the national implementation of 1325, opportunities and challenges, and was Ricky
we discussed during what was a very lively and a very interesting exchange of opinions and ideas. One of the first points that was made is that Ireland has a national action plan, so let's just get on with implementing it. And to be able to do so, we need political and social will. The method of implementation is very important. We need to ensure that what we implement is robust. We need realistic and achievable goals. NAPs should be seen as living documents that can be adapted to changing contexts. And NAPs need to develop a culture so that content and the mission of 1325 become almost second nature. That's really all I wanted to say. Maybe we can expand on some of those ideas when we have our main discussion.
Right, Sharon's table, and Shirley, we're looking at beyond numbers, how best to integrate women into peacekeeping and peace building. And Hannah was the note taker. Okay, Hannah.
Kind of central questions. Just to bring up a few points that I think are quite stimulating. We discussed the unintended consequences of 1325 around peace building, and with the specific example of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and how you need to be careful that you don't build in or solidify victim identities when, you know, in a post-conflict context, or incentivize certain roles. The example of widows was given that there was a financial incentive to being identified with that context, and it prevented people from being able to move on with their lives. So it was almost a conflict vacuum, and I thought that was a very interesting element. The fact that, in a sense, and Shirley mentioned this, that conflict identities can constantly reinforce disempowerment for women, even if it's beneficial. Like the widows maintain their identity as widows, whereas men were able to move beyond their identities in the conflict into a kind of a post-conflict heroism. So that was very interesting. Also, we discussed the idea of quotas, which came up, of course, in other tables, and how we would ever be able to construct a different paradigm without bringing women to the table. And that was a central question. Do quotas need to exist to physically bring women to the table in order to construct a new reality and to have their voices heard? We debated the ideas around the universal standard that is represented by gender equality, and how that interacts with cultural perspectives, and how you need to use the perspective of grassroots organisations and a top-down approach, for example, like quotas, how you need to bring those together to really create the balance that 1325 and the intersectionality that 1325 requires to succeed. We talked about how it's not just systems of change that are required. It's not just institutional change, but attitudinal change, and that's a more complex thing to identify and to discuss and to measure. And it doesn't necessarily fit within a results-based framework. And moving beyond the numbers, you can say, even 50% of a peacekeeping force might be women, but it can come down to how are they respected, what are their roles, what positions do they hold. So we discussed how it's about attitudes and not just numbers. We also discussed how the practical implications, and there were some really interesting examples of how women in Northern Ireland were forced into a position of active involvement, that it was out of necessity that the women were brought into the situation. They had to be there, and they played a huge role there, but it wasn't necessarily a form of gender empowerment. It was out of necessity. And that there's an interesting parallel there to military strategic application for gender engagement, that for the military there is a strategic outcome to engaging with women, and that they are 50% of the population of a host country, and that it makes sense from a military perspective to engage with women on the ground, but it's not necessarily through the lens of 1325. It's got a military application that might be outside of that. So finally, the last point was that we challenged the implicit assumption that more women means a problem solved. And that it is about numbers, and Shirley said a great thing, it is about numbers, but it's also about more than numbers. If women aren't there, and I'm just going to paraphrase what Shirley was saying, if women aren't there, their voices cannot be heard, and their diverse experiences cannot be recognised, they remain invisible. But of course, numbers aren't enough alone. And just to finish off, there was a huge diversity of perspectives here from an academic angle and a grassroots experience-based angle, but fundamentally the understanding here was that women are always a part of war, and therefore their roles must always be a factor in the discourse around peace.
Thank you very much.
We had a long day today, as I said, but a very intense, a very interesting day, where experience, expertise and perspectives were shared amongst all of us. May I all label us experts, and that's what we are in our very own, and some of the speakers and some of the contributors have pointed that out in our very own area. We had, I'd just like to run through some parts of today, just to remind you, and with this reminder goes also an ask to, if you haven't done so, maybe fill out your evaluation forms. We'd really love to hear what you thought about today, and we'd love to hear what further learning we can do, and leave your evaluation forms if you have filled it in with Valeska, who just raises her hand there to my right. So we had a very powerful start of the day with a keynote speech, which was not only comprehensively outlining factual challenges or opportunities, but also added a human face by bringing in a truly impacting story and opening the day with this story of Malala Yousafzai. And I think that keynote speech of our distinguished speaker, Anne Anderson, set a bit the note of the day. And the note of the day, which I have seen listening into small table discussions, was bringing together processual, factual knowledge, but also emotional knowledge, experiences that was sometimes not being seen as valuable, for example, in academia, or when we talk about knowledge generation. So looking at the different areas of knowledge, looking at the different ways knowledge has been generated, which has been picked up by different speakers. And what has been also outlined in the keynote speech were questions asked like, how can UN Security Council Resolution 1325 work? And I think that has been brought through the speeches of Liz McManus, Avila Kilmurray, and Hannah Cueva-Beteta and Giulia Pasquanelli, in how can it work for different constituents at different times? How can we bring in change? How can we bring in changing voices? It has been highlighted by many speakers, the importance of participation of CSOs. Liz McManus has that pointed out when we talked about the development of the Irish National Action Plan and future perspectives of where we're moving. Avila Kilmurray has pointed out in particular the challenges we're facing moving out of conflict being in, and the question mark behind that, post-conflict in Ireland, North and South. What does that even mean if young women, and that brings in the intergenerational aspect, if young women in Newtown Abbey have experienced or are experiencing an increased rate of domestic violence, increased experience of domestic violence. So where does that lead us when we talk about experiences of different people, or as our distinguished academic speakers Ruth Jacobson and Erika Svedberg have brought it in when we talk about intersectionality, like how different discrimination, how different oppressions, how different situations affect people differently. So, so moving from very moving accounts, opening accounts, and then situation in Ireland, North, South, to a more global perspective, Hani Beteta, Cueva Beteta, and I always mix those two surnames up, and I should know better. Hani Cueva Beteta and Giulia Pasquinelli brought in a very powerful account of what is happening currently in the UN and in the EU respectively. From, I was first inclined to say a policy and then an activism perspective, but I think somehow the two of you have managed to bring both policy and activism perspective or practitioner perspective in your presentation, and you have done that very well and have made it very accessible for all of us. And what has been particularly highlighted from the international and regional perspective is the data. We think we are beyond numbers as academics, and we very often, you see it in a lot of academic articles on women, peace and security published, beyond numbers. And of course, and it has been stressed again and again and again, we need to look at the meaning. What is the meaning of participation for people? It can't just be add, woman and steer, as I picked up in some of the small table presentations. But if we don't have the numbers, and Giulia and Hannah both made that argument very powerfully, Giulia in particular talking about the EU, if we don't have the numbers, if we don't have the statistics and the data, well, how can we make a powerful argument to convince those who are in power at the moment? How can we bring everyone on the same line, and making what Anne Carr just highlighted a few minutes ago, turning this theoretical thought, these challenges we're outlining today, into opportunities and really real changes in creating change for women and men globally, in particular situations of peace and conflict. The afternoon session was started off by two very interesting academic presentations, and they kind of brought a little bit of different perspective to the day. The morning session was looking at what have we done, where do we want to move, so more the doing perspective from a policy level, and then the academic perspective brought in a little bit thinking, as one participant told me, thinking out of the box, bringing a different perspective to it, thinking how can we actually, and using now Ruth Jacobs' notion of language, or was it Ruth, or no, it was actually Erika who brought it in, or somebody, the use of language, so how can language be used to communicate between activists and academics, and that was some of the notes of this conference, to bring or open a space to allow for us to come together from different perspectives and discuss the impact and innovation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, because as many of you told me, so often the area of academia and activism, academia and policy making are interlinked but very often isolated and detached. Yet, when we look at who is being asked for joining consultative boards, and I'm looking at my own membership at the monitoring board here, it's often academics who sit in there as well. So I think there's a very important bridge to be built between, even more so than it has been already done. And I know that there has been a lot of credit given to efforts already made. The afternoon discussion now brought in new voices, and I would really love to thank you all for being so participatory, for really, I haven't had the chance to multiply myself and participate in all the small table discussions, but the little glimpses I got of the small table discussions were so interesting. It went from should we even talk about women, the whole debate about gender and the notion of gender. It went through really concrete examples on how we're not dealing with sexual violence, yet always highlighting it, towards participatory perspectives and critical interrogations, and I mentioned it earlier on, numbers, add women and steer, or what else is needed. And there were very innovative ideas, I think, who came out of that. And my wish for all of you, having participated in this conference and having participated so creatively and so well as you did and so inspiring as you all did, is that you're leaving this conference, and I'm not having any idea here that everyone has found all the answers, but my wish is that everyone leaves this conference with some more questions to be addressed and to be discussed. And that is my wish, that we have a follow-up from this conference. Jennifer, who so eloquently, who has been a really great supporter in this project, Jennifer Todd, that is, who is director